The world, in my opinion, operates best on a grid. Lines, schedules, predictable outcomes. My life was a testament to that philosophy. My apartment was a study in minimalist order. My career at Apex Designs was built on meticulous 5-year plans, and my proposal for the Phoenix Project, the single biggest urban renewal contract the city had seen in a decade, was bound in navy leather, its contents cross-referenced and indexed to perfection. It was my masterpiece, the culmination of a year of sleepless nights and relentless focus. And then there was Peyto Torres. She didn't walk into a room. She was more like a weather event that happened to be contained within a human form. I first saw her at the preliminary stakeholder meeting, a chaotic swirl of wild, dark curls that defied gravity, a bespoke blazer thrown over a vintage band t-shirt, and eyes the color of moss after a rainstorm. She represented Catalyst Creations, a boutique firm known for its disruptive, a word I despised, and unpredictable ideas. Where I built foundations, she launched fireworks. I was at the podium, walking the city council through my phased implementation strategy, when she raised her hand. Her question wasn't a question. It was a surgical dismantling of my core premise, wrapped in a deceptively casual tone. "Ms. Vance," she said, a slow, disarming smile playing on her lips, a smile that probably worked wonders on clients, but felt like a thinly veiled challenge to me. "Your plan is immaculate, but it feels like you're designing a perfect museum exhibit. Where's the heartbeat? Where's the chaos that makes a city breathe?" My knuckles went white on the lectern. A city's heartbeat, Ms. Torres, is its infrastructure, its reliability. My plan ensures that it will beat for the next 100 years. The polite applause that followed felt hollow. She had, in 30 seconds, painted me as a rigid architect of a beautiful cage, while she positioned herself as the champion of the city's soul. She was the antithesis of everything I valued: preparation, control, and quiet competence. That animosity simmered for weeks, a low-grade fire fueled by passive-aggressive emails and thinly veiled barbs in industry newsletters. So when my boss, Mr. Sterling, called me into the main conference room, the last person I expected to see standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows was Peyto Torres, looking just as out of place among the polished mahogany and brushed steel as a wildflower in a hydroponic lab. She inclined her head, a silent acknowledgement. "Vance." "Torres," I replied, my voice tight. I placed my leather-bound proposal on the table between us. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. Her own notes, I saw with a flicker of disdain, were a series of sketches and what looked like lyrical snippets on a single, folded sheet of paper. Mr. Sterling entered, flanked by Peyto's own CEO, Ms. Albright, a woman with an equally unnerving artistic flair. The pleasantries were brief. "Camila Peyto," Mr. Sterling began, his hands clasped behind his back. "The Phoenix Project is a monumental undertaking. The board has reviewed the preliminary offerings from both Apex and Catalyst. Apex's proposal is a masterclass in logistical planning. Catalyst's is a visionary marvel." I allowed myself a small, internal nod of satisfaction. "And," he continued, his eyes moving between us, "they are both, on their own, incomplete." My stomach dropped. I glanced at Peyto. For the first time, a crack appeared in her confident facade, a flicker of uncertainty in those moss-green eyes. "The board has decided," Sterling said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "that the only way this project will achieve its full potential is with the strengths of both your firms. You will be submitting a joint proposal. You two will be co-leading the project. Congratulations." The word hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden, vast silence. I looked at my perfectly ordered proposal, my blueprint for success, and then I looked at Peyto Torres, the embodiment of chaos. It was like being told to collaborate with a hurricane. We were no longer competitors. We were partners. And I had the sickening feeling that the storm was just beginning. Our first week as co-leads was less of a collaboration and more of a Cold War fought across a shared drafting table. The conference room assigned to us became a demilitarized zone, my side a fortress of color-coded binders, organized timelines, and freshly sharpened pencils. Her side was an explosion of sketch pads, coffee-stained napkins bearing frantic-looking diagrams, and a playlist of obscure indie rock that drifted from her earbuds. "I've mapped out a project timeline with key deliverables for the next 6 weeks," I said on Monday morning, sliding a pristine Gantt chart across the table. "If we adhere to this, we can integrate our concepts logically and efficiently." Peyto picked it up, holding it like it was a strange, dead insect. She tilted her head. "This is beautiful, Camila. Seriously. It's like a work of art." She didn't look at the details, only the structure. But creativity doesn't work on a spreadsheet. We can't schedule an epiphany for Tuesday at 2 p.m. We can schedule the work that leads to one, I countered, my voice dangerously calm. Structure doesn't kill creativity. It gives it a place to grow. She just gave me that infuriating, gentle smile and went back to her sketchbook. The chart remained untouched on the edge of the table for the rest of the day, a silent monument to our ideological divide. The days bled into a frustrating rhythm of clashing methodologies. I would arrive at 8 a.m. sharp with a clear agenda. Peyto would drift in around 10, smelling of coffee and rain, her mind already buzzing with a dozen half-formed ideas that completely disregarded the previous day's work. She'd want to talk about the emotional texture of a public space. I'd want to finalize the schematics for its drainage system. "You're trying to build a body by starting with the skeleton," she told me once, leaning over a blueprint I'd spent hours perfecting. "I'm trying to figure out what kind of soul it's going to have first." "A soul is useless if the skeleton collapses, Peyto." I shot back, my patience worn to a microscopic thread. The project wasn't just stalling, it was regressing. Our initial concepts, once praised for their individual strengths, were now a mangled hybrid of competing visions. My logical frameworks were being smothered by her abstract flourishes, and her innovative designs were being crippled by my insistence on practical constraints. We weren't building something new, we were just tearing each other's work down. The breaking point came during a check-in with Mr. Sterling and Ms. Albright. We presented our progress, a disjointed collection of slides that screamed dysfunction. The silence that followed our presentation was heavier than any criticism. Mr. Sterling finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of its usual warmth. "This isn't a partnership. This is a stalemate. You are two of the brightest young minds in the city, and you are producing nothing." Ms. Albright nodded in agreement. The board's decision was not a suggestion. It was a directive. "Your inability to work together is jeopardizing not just this project, but the reputations of both our firms." I stared at the polished surface of the table. I could feel Peyto's presence beside me, rigid and silent. All that confidence she usually radiated had evaporated, leaving a vacuum of tense energy. "You have 1 week," Mr. Sterling said, the finality of his tone like a gavel strike. 1 week to present a unified, coherent preliminary draft. If you can't, we will dissolve this partnership and pull both of your names from the Phoenix Project entirely. The unspoken threat was clear. This would be a failure we'd never recover from. He didn't need to say more. We were dismissed. We walked back to our conference room in suffocating silence. The air, which had been thick with animosity for weeks, was now filled with the cold, sharp dread of shared failure. For the first time, it wasn't her versus me. It was us versus the abyss. The next morning, I found a single sheet of paper on my side of the table. It wasn't a report or a schedule. It was a note, written in Peyto's elegant, chaotic script. 7 p.m. The Black Cat Cafe. Neutral ground. The Black Cat Cafe was a sterile, soulless place halfway between our offices, known for its mediocre coffee and complete lack of ambience. It was the perfect place for a peace talk. There was absolutely no danger of either of us feeling comfortable. I arrived at 7 on the dot. Peyto was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of tea. She wasn't sketching or listening to music. She was just watching the traffic, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she looked less like a force of nature and more like a person who was just as cornered as I was. I slid into the booth opposite her. The vinyl was cool and cracked against my legs. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The only sounds were the hiss of the espresso machine and the distant murmur of the evening news from a television above the bar. "This isn't working," I said finally, stating the painfully obvious.
"No."
"It's not," she agreed, her gaze still fixed on the street outside. Then she turned to look at me, and her moss-green eyes were clear, stripped of their usual playful challenge. "Your system suffocates my process." "And your process," I replied, keeping my tone even, "is a tornado that destroys my system." She gave a small, humorless smile. "Fair enough." She took a sip of her tea. "Look, Vance.
"Camila."
I don't like this any more than you do. But I'm not going to let my career go down in flames, because we can't get out of our own way. And I assume you feel the same." I nodded, my shoulders slumping with a fraction of the tension I'd been carrying for weeks. "I do." "So," she said, leaning forward slightly, her hands wrapped around her mug. "How do we do this? Without wanting to metaphorically or literally strangle each other." This was the opening. The chance to reset. I took a deep breath, pushing aside my pride. "We need lanes. Clearly defined lanes. You're right, I can't schedule your creativity. And I can't function without structure. So let's divide it." I pulled a pen and a clean napkin from the dispenser. The irony was not lost on me, and started to sketch. "I'll handle the project architecture. The timelines, the budget allocation, the compliance checks, the entire logistical framework. I will build the strongest, most stable container possible." I pushed the napkin toward her. "And you," I said, looking her directly in the eye, "can fill it with whatever brilliant, chaotic, soul-filled ideas you have. I won't question your vision if you don't question my foundation." She studied the napkin for a long time, her expression thoughtful. She traced the lines I'd drawn with her finger. It was a massive concession for both of us. For me, it meant relinquishing creative control. For her, it meant accepting boundaries. It was an admission that we were incomplete on our own. "Okay," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm.
"Okay, Vance.
We try it your way. We try it our way." There were no apologies exchanged. No handshakes. But as we sat there in the silence of that generic cafe, a fragile truce settled between us. It wasn't built on trust or respect, not yet. It was built on the cold, hard foundation of mutual desperation. But for the first time, it felt like we were looking at the same problem instead of seeing each other as the problem. The new system was functional. It was like two different languages being spoken in the same room, but with an effective, if clunky, translator. I would spend my days building the digital and physical models, mapping out material costs and zoning variances, creating the container as we'd agreed. Peyto would come in, usually in the afternoon, and start to fill it. She'd pin swatches of fabric to the wall, talking about how the texture of the public benches should feel like a well-worn book. She'd create soundscapes, playlists that were meant to evoke the feeling of a particular courtyard at dusk. I thought it was absurd, but I held my tongue. I focused on my lanes. I made sure her poetic benches were weatherproof and compliant with city codes. Our interactions were minimal and strictly professional. "I need the load-bearing capacity for the central plaza," I'd say. "I'm thinking of a living green wall for the east facade. What are the irrigation requirements?" she'd ask. It was sterile, but it was progress. The disjointed mess of a project started to slowly, painstakingly, cohere into something with a dual identity, my logic and her vision, coexisting in a delicate balance. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night. We were the only two left in the entire office building, a fact announced by the deep, humming silence that had replaced the daytime buzz. We'd hit a wall, a literal one. A heritage bylaw prevented us from altering the facade of an old warehouse that was central to our design, but its internal structure was a logistical nightmare. It was a fatal flaw that threatened to unravel the entire plan. I'd been running simulations for 3 hours, and every solution was either too expensive or structurally unsound. I threw my pencil down on the desk in disgust. "It's a dead end," I announced to the empty room. The entire green space initiative for this quadrant depended on reconfiguring that building. Peyto, who had been quietly sketching in her notebook for the past hour, looked up. She hadn't said a word, just watched me grow more and more frustrated. She walked over to the main blueprint, her expression intense. "We're thinking about it backwards," she said softly, almost to herself. "We're trying to force the building to fit our plan." She picked up a thick marker. What if the plan fits the building? Before I could object to her defacing my pristine blueprint, she began to draw. Her movements were fluid and certain. She wasn't erasing my work, she was flowing around it. Instead of moving the walls, she turned the entire interior into a kind of vertical public garden, with walkways suspended from the original support beams. She transformed the building's biggest constraint into its most dramatic feature. It wasn't just a solution, it was a stroke of genius. It was beautiful, audacious, and I realized with a jolt, completely feasible within my structural framework. I stared at the drawing, then back at her. The low light from the desk lamp caught the sharp line of her jaw and the intense focus in her eyes. The air was still and quiet. In that moment, she wasn't the chaotic rival who annoyed me. She was a creator, an artist who saw possibilities where I only saw problems. I started, my voice hoarse. That could actually work. A slow smile spread across her face, but it was different from her usual confident smirk. This one was softer, a little tired, but genuinely pleased.
"Yeah," she said.
"I think it could." I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't about the project anymore. It was a flicker of something I hadn't felt before, genuine, unadulterated admiration. The armor I'd built around myself, my carefully constructed fortress of logic and control, had just sustained its first crack. After the night of the warehouse solution, the atmosphere in our shared space began to change. The truce, once brittle and based on necessity, softened at the edges. The silence between us was no longer a weapon, but a space for quiet concentration. We still kept to our lanes, but I found myself watching her more, my observations shifting from critical analysis to simple, unfiltered curiosity. I started to notice the small details that composed the person named Peyto Torres. She had a tiny, silver compass tattooed on the inside of her left wrist, something I only saw when she pushed up her sleeves to draw. I wondered if it was a reminder to stay true to her own direction, or a symbol of a more literal journey. I noticed the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was on the verge of a breakthrough, her brow furrowed in concentration. And there was her scent. I'd initially found it distracting, but now I recognized it as a unique blend of coffee, the faint, clean smell of expensive paper, and something else, something like damp earth after a storm. It was the smell of her creative process. One afternoon, while I was calibrating a 3D model, she was on a call with a supplier. Her voice was different from the one she used with me or in presentations. It was lower, warmer, laced with an easy laughter. I realized I'd only ever seen the professional warrior, the creative disruptor. I had no idea what she was like when she wasn't in battle. She hung up and caught me looking. I quickly turned back to my screen, a faint heat rising in my cheeks. "Just a supplier for the reclaimed wood," she said, as if sensing my unspoken question. "My dad's an architect. He always said to treat your suppliers like your partners, not your servants." She offered this piece of personal history casually, a small, unexpected gift. "He taught you how to draw like that?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, my dad designs things that can withstand earthquakes. He thinks my work is whimsical." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a fond exasperation. In that small confession, I saw a flicker of the girl who had to fight to prove that beauty was just as important as stability. It resonated with a part of me that had always had to defend my own meticulous nature against accusations of being cold or uninspired. Our own interactions started to shift. She began to show a surprising deference to my expertise. She'd bring me a wild sketch and ask, "Can you make this real, Camila?" The question was a genuine appeal to my strength, an acknowledgement of her own limitations. And I, in turn, would find ways to make her impossible ideas work, a challenge I started to secretly enjoy. One evening, I was struggling with a complex budget projection, the numbers blurring in front of my eyes. I must have sighed audibly, because she looked up from her work. "You've been staring at that for an hour," she said. "Your brain is going to melt." "It's my job to stare at it until it makes sense," I muttered. She got up and walked over to the small kitchenette in the corner of the office. She came back a few minutes later and placed a steaming mug on my desk. It was tea, a fragrant blend of chamomile and mint. "My dad's other advice," she said softly. "Never try to solve a complex problem without a cup of tea." I looked from the mug to her face. Her expression was open, her gaze direct. There was no agenda, no strategy. It was just a simple, kind gesture. A moment of quiet care. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, the gesture feeling strangely intimate in the sterile office environment. The animosity that had defined our beginning felt like a distant memory, replaced by a fragile, tentative connection. I didn't have a name for it yet, so I just filed it away, an anomaly in my carefully ordered world. As the project gained momentum, our worlds shrank until they were confined to the four walls of that conference room. The physical space between us seemed to contract with each passing day. We were no longer on opposite sides of the table. We worked side by side at the large central monitor, our shoulders sometimes brushing as we pointed to details on a digital rendering. I became acutely aware of her presence in a way that had nothing to do with work. I knew the sound of her breathing when she was concentrating, a slow, steady rhythm. I knew the exact shade of green in her eyes when the afternoon light hit them just right. The air between us started to feel different, charged with an unspoken current. It was a low hum of awareness that was both deeply unsettling and strangely compelling. The line between late nights at the office and our lives outside of it began to blur. We'd order takeout and eat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clicking of my keyboard and the soft scratch of her pencil on paper. These weren't the tense, tactical silences of our early days. They were shared, easy voids, filled with the quiet energy of two people working towards a common goal. One night, we were working on the final model, a miniature version of our shared vision. It was almost midnight, and the city outside was a glittering tapestry of distant lights. We were leaning over the model, making tiny adjustments. I reached for a miniature tree at the same moment she did. Our fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, incidental contact, but it sent a quiet spark through me. I pulled my hand back gently, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I risked a glance at her. She was looking at her own hand, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet mine. Her expression was unguarded, her usual confident mask completely gone. In its place was a raw, questioning vulnerability that mirrored my own. The air grew thick, heavy. The low hum between us intensified into a palpable thrum. The vast, silent office seemed to shrink, pulling us into its vortex until there was nothing but the two of us, the miniature city at our feet, and the chasm of unspoken things between us. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just held my gaze, and in that long, silent moment, a new and terrifying question began to form in my mind. It had nothing to do with blueprints or budgets. It was a question about the strange, undeniable gravity that was pulling me toward the one person I was so sure I was meant to push away. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath my feet was starting to crumble. The whispers started subtly. A few curious glances in the hallway, a senior partner from another department asking how the unlikely alliance was faring. Our seamless collaboration, once a source of internal relief, was now becoming a topic of industry gossip. Simultaneously, a rival firm, Vortex Designs, who had also vied for the Phoenix project, began a vicious smear campaign. They snuck into our shared server late one night and altered key financial data in our budget models, then leaked the doctor numbers to a trade blog, claiming our project was financially unfeasible and riddled with
waste.
The timing couldn't have been worse. We were just days away from the critical board meeting to finalize our contract. This external pressure, instead of driving us apart, had the opposite effect. It forged us into a tighter unit. We were no longer just colleagues. We were co-conspirators, defending our creation against a common enemy. We pulled 3 all-nighters in a row, cross-referencing every transaction, rebuilding the budget from scratch, and gathering evidence of Vortex's hacking, traces of their digital footprint in the server logs. Peyto used her creative connections to secure an emergency meeting with the trade blog's editor, while I prepared an airtight presentation to prove the validity of our original numbers. The crisis culminated on a rainy Tuesday. We were called into an emergency meeting with the board to address the rumors. We stood side by side, a united front. I presented the numbers with cold, irrefutable logic, walking the board through our reconstructed budget and displaying the server logs that proved Vortex's tampering. Peyto followed, speaking with a fierce, quiet passion about the project's integrity and vision, and sharing the editor's promise to issue a retraction and expose Vortex's unethical tactics. We didn't just defend our work, we championed it, our arguments weaving together perfectly. The board was convinced. The threat was neutralized. We left the boardroom, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly ebbing away, leaving a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration in its wake. The rain was lashing against the tall windows of the lobby, encasing us in a gray, private world. We did it. I breathed, the words feeling inadequate. We did it. Peyto corrected me, her voice soft. She was looking at me, her eyes dark and intense. The relief of our victory mingled with the ever-present tension between us, creating a volatile, potent cocktail. The elevator arrived, its doors sighing open. We stepped inside, the polished steel walls reflecting our tired forms. As the doors slid shut, sealing us in the small, silent space, the energy between us became overwhelming. The professional crisis was over, but the personal one was reaching its peak. She didn't move closer, but her gaze was a gentle weight. "You were brilliant in there, Camila," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the elevator. "They couldn't argue with your facts. And they were mesmerized by your vision," I replied, my own voice unsteady. "No one can argue with that." The elevator stopped at our floor. The doors opened, but neither of us moved. The world outside our small metal box could wait. Slowly, as if asking for permission, she lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. Her touch was light, hesitant. My breath caught in my throat. This was at the tipping point, the moment where everything could change. She leaned in, her eyes searching mine for any sign of resistance. I didn't move. I couldn't. In that moment, suspended between floors, between rivalry and something else entirely, I could only stand my ground and let it happen. She pressed a soft, brief kiss to my cheek, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that had been building between us for months. It wasn't a firework. It was the slow, inevitable turning of a key in a lock I hadn't even known was there. The day of the final presentation felt like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. The gossip had died down, Vortex Designs was facing disciplinary action from the industry board, and all that was left was the work itself. We walked into the grand boardroom, the same room where we had been forced into this partnership, not as two separate entities, but as a single, cohesive unit. I had my notes, of course, but for the first time, I didn't feel chained to them. Peyto stood beside me, not with her usual restless energy, but with a centered, powerful stillness. We shared a look, a quick, silent exchange that said everything. "We've got this," I began, laying out the foundation of the Phoenix project. My voice was steady and clear as I detailed the structural integrity, the phased rollout, the sustainable financial model. I wasn't just presenting data. I was telling the first half of a story, building the strong, reliable world that Peyto was about to bring to life. I built the skeleton, bone by logical bone. When I finished, I turned the floor over to her. "And now, my partner, Peyto Torres, will walk you through the soul of the project." Peyto stepped forward. She didn't use the podium. She moved around the room, using her hands to paint pictures in the air, her voice a captivating blend of passion and expertise. She spoke of the vertical gardens not as an architectural feature, but as the lungs of the neighborhood. She described the public plazas as the city's living rooms. She gave our design a heartbeat, a personality. She was weaving poetry around my prose, and the result was a narrative so compelling the entire board was spellbound. During the Q&A, our synergy was undeniable. A question about budget overruns would come my way, and I'd answer it with precise figures, only for Peyto to jump in seamlessly. And the reason that investment is so crucial, she'd add, is because it allows for the use of locally sourced materials, which not only reduces our carbon footprint, but also invests directly back into the community. A question about her more whimsical designs would be aimed at her, and she'd give a visionary answer before turning to me. And Camila's stress testing models prove that this design is not only beautiful, but is actually more durable in high wind conditions than a traditional structure. We were a closed loop, a perfect feedback system. We didn't just know the project. We knew each other's thoughts. When it was over, a silence fell over the room, but it was different from the one we'd experienced before. It was a silence of awe. Mr. Sterling stood up, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Ladies," he said, his voice full of respect. "Congratulations. The Phoenix Project is yours." A round of applause erupted. I felt a dizzying rush of relief and triumph. I turned to Peyto, and she was already looking at me, her eyes shining. In front of the entire board, she broke professional protocol. She closed the small distance between us and wrapped her arms around me in a brief, firm hug. It was over in a second, but I felt the warmth of her embrace, the solid reality of our shared victory. This wasn't just a win for our firms. It was ours. We had taken something broken and on the verge of collapse, our project, our professional relationship, and built something extraordinary from the ashes. Winning should have been the final, triumphant chord. Instead, it was followed by a strange and deafening silence. The project was ours, but the frantic, all-consuming work that had defined our existence for months, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. The mandatory reason for being in each other's orbit was normal, for sharing coffee at midnight and debating the merits about what was between us felt normal or professional anymore. The next day, we met at a quiet, upscale bar downtown, and a place with dark wood and meticulously organized binders. It was a world away from the sterile cafes, sketches were being carefully rolled into tubes. Without blueprints and spreadsheets between us, and with it, I felt the structure of our relationship. We were just Camila and was Peyto, the one who broke the silence. Two people with a complicated history, celebrate, she said, an undefined her voice future. Sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet first. A drink. We talked about the board's tonight, reaction, about the next steps, about anything other than what was really on our minds. The silence that fell between sips of wine was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Peyto set her glass down and looked at me, her gaze direct and unflinching. "So what happens now, Camila?" The question hung in the air, simple and terrifying. "The project moves into the development phase," I began, defaulting to the professional script. "We'll be overseeing the—" "That's not what I mean," she interrupted softly. "I mean with us. The project was the container. What happens now that it's gone?" There it was. The question I had been avoiding, the one my logical mind had no answer for. I looked down at my hands, at the way the dim light caught on my watch. All my life, I had relied on plans, on predictable outcomes. But with her, there was no blueprint. "I don't know," I admit it, the words feeling small and inadequate. It was the most honest thing I'd said all night. "Me neither," she confessed, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "But I know that I don't want this whatever it is to just end because the work is done. What we have is more than just a good working relationship. You know that, right?" I lifted my eyes to meet hers. The world around us seemed to fade away, the clinking glasses and low chatter of the bar dissolving into a distant hum. All I could see was her, the earnest, hopeful, and slightly fearful expression on her face. And I realized that the thought of my life returning to its neat, orderly grid, a grid that didn't include her chaos, her brilliance, her unexpected kindness, was unbearable. The fear of the unknown was immense, but the fear of losing her was greater. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know." She leaned across the table, and this time, I met her halfway. Our lips touched in a soft, tentative kiss, a quiet promise that we would figure it out together. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a plan. But it was a start. It was an acknowledgement. In the quiet aftermath of our professional storm, we had finally admitted that something real and vital had taken root. A month later, I stood with Peyto on a windswept hill overlooking a vast, empty lot. Below us was the sprawling expanse of dirt, concrete, and skeletal remains of old industry that would, in time, become the Phoenix Project. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the distant sounds of the city, a siren, the rumble of a train, the constant hum of life. Our lives had found a new, uncertain rhythm. There were no more mandatory late nights at the office, but there were hesitant phone calls that turned into hours-long conversations. There were dinners where we talked about everything and nothing, her childhood in a noisy, artistic family, my quiet, academic upbringing. We were slowly, carefully, sketching the outlines of each other's lives, filling in the details that had been hidden behind our professional facades. It wasn't easy. My instinct was to define what we were, to put a label on it, and file it away neatly. Her instinct was to let it be, to let it grow organically without the pressure of a name. We were still, in many ways, an exercise in opposing forces. It's terrifying, isn't it? Peyto said, her voice almost carried away by the wind. She gestured to the empty lot below. All that potential. All that space for things to go wrong. I knew she wasn't just talking about the construction site.
She was talking about us.
It's also a lot of space for things to go right. I countered, the words feeling natural, optimistic even. It was the kind of thing she would normally say, and the role reversal made her smile. Look at you, Vance, she teased gently. Finding the poetry in a dirt lot. I'm learning from an expert, I said, a genuine smile touching my own lips. She had chipped away at my rigid edges, teaching me that the most beautiful things are often the most unpredictable. And I hoped, had given her a sense of stability, a safe harbor for her brilliant, stormy mind. We weren't changing each other. We were making room for each other, expanding our own boundaries to accommodate a new, unexpected reality. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cool from the wind, but her grip was warm and firm. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. It was simple, quiet, and real. It was an anchor in the vast uncertainty of what lay before us. We stood there for a long time, watching the sun begin to set, casting long shadows across the future site of our shared creation. There was no 5-year plan for this. There was no Gantt chart that could map out our feelings. The future of our relationship was as raw and unwritten as the landscape before us. For the first time in my life, I was looking at a blank page not with fear, but with a quiet sense of anticipation. We had our foundation, one forged in animosity, tempered by respect, and solidified by a connection neither of us had seen coming. The rest, we would have to build together, one day at a time, with no blueprint to guide us. And for the first time, that felt like enough.